Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about the other division of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, otherwise known as rest and digest. So, when we activate the parasympathetic nervous system, it's usually not an all-in thing like the sympathetic nervous system is. Usually we're going to activate different parts of it at different times, but overall, it's all about slowing things down, turning inward, taking care of internal matters. We're going to feed ourselves, we're going to digest, extract nutrients from that food. We're going to filter things out of our bloodstream that we don't want and excrete them in the urine. We're going to have a bowel movement now that we're nice and relaxed and there's no predator nearby. We're going to do all the things we need to do to take care of internal matters. So like before where I used the running man every time we were talking about sympathetic nervous system, I'm going to use the relaxing frog for parasympathetic just so that you can have a quick visual cue as to which system we're talking about. Now, that said, the parasympathetic nervous system, just like the sympathetic, the whole thing, it's a two-neuron system. So just reminding you, we're going to have that preganglionic neuron with its cell body or soma in the central nervous system, which is then sending its axon out. So here it is in the central nervous system, which is going to send its axon out to a ganglion where it's going to synapse with the second neuron, which is called the postganglionic neuron, which is going to send its axon out to whatever our effector organ is, right? Whether that's the heart or the salivary glands, whatever it may be. So like with the sympathetic nervous system, the hypothalamus is in charge of the autonomic nervous system. So that's who's going to be sending signals to the preganglionic neuron, the first of that two neuron system. And the preganglionic neurons are going to live in two places. So you might remember for sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron cell bodies lived in the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord. But for parasympathetic, they live in the brainstem and in the sacral spinal cord. So it's interesting. They have their own turf, right? So never the twain shall meet. So the preganglionic neurons are going to be located up in the brainstem or down in the sacral spinal cord. Then we're going to have those preganglionic axons travel out in nerves. Now, what's interesting is that we don't have the ganglia in this case aren't going to be really close to the brainstem or the spinal cord. So the axons have to travel out through nerves. So they're very long, these axons. They are going to travel, and in cranial nerves if we're going to be supplying the head and the neck. So when we're talking about dilation or constriction of the pupil of the eye, when we're talking about salivating so that we can digest, right? Then we're going to use cranial nerves 3, 7, and 9 for that. But then interestingly, here comes the vagus. So I've been teasing you for a long time that we were going to talk about the motor functions of the vagus nerve eventually. Here we are. So the vagus nerve is supplying the autonomic visceral motor signals to most of our viscera. So what we see here in this diagram actually is that vagus nerve. Comes out of the brainstem, travels down through the neck, and then it supplies all of these organs in your thoracic and abdominal cavities. So remember, it's called the wanderer because it sends signals everywhere. So yeah. Now, then there's also going to be sacral nerves for some of the genitalia, the bladder, and some of the rectum. And these preganglionic axons, when they get out eventually to their ganglia, they are going to release acetylcholine in the synapse. So that's going to be just like what we saw with the sympathetic nervous system, that the first neuron, the preganglionic neuron, releases acetylcholine at its synapse. So that synapse is, of course, going to be in the parasympathetic ganglia. And unlike the sympathetic nervous system, which you see on the left here in blue, so this is the sympathetic nervous system over here, where the ganglia were very close to the spinal cord. Over here on this side, now we have a schematic of the parasympathetic nervous system. So you can see here's our preganglionic neuron cell bodies in the brainstem and down in the sacral spinal cord. And then look at how long these axons are. Right? Look at how long these axons are, because the ganglia are located way out here, either right next to or sometimes even right on the organs themselves. So the preganglionic axons have a long way to go because the ganglia are very close to or right on the effectors. And then the postganglionic neurons that live in these ganglia have really short axons, right? Really short axons then to go to the organ, and they're going to release their neurotransmitter, which is also acetylcholine. So what's interesting about parasympathetic nervous system is it's acetylcholine, whereas in sympathetic was acetylcholine and then epinephrine at the synapse. So there's a little difference. Okay, what effects is the parasympathetic nervous system going to have? We already talked about this a little bit, but what I've given you here is a table that kind of compares and contrasts the two systems. And you can see that in many ways they kind of oppose each other, which makes sense. So the parasympathetic nervous system, if we're just chillaxing, we're going to constrict the pupil. We don't really need to pay so much attention to our visual environment. It's going to actively decrease the heart rate. And of course, the heart is in our thoracic cavity, and so that's receiving signals via the vagus nerve. We're also going to constrict and close our bronchioles, those air tubes in the lungs. We don't need to hold them open quite so much. We can let them be a little bit more closed. You'd say, why would we ever do that? Well, why have extra capacity if you don't need it? Also, we're a little less vulnerable to accidentally inhaling something that might be bad for us, right? So it's kind of a good thing to do. And then we're going to increase activity of the whole digestive system. So we're going to be able to salivate, we're going to secrete digestive juices, we're going to peristalse things through, including then peristalsing things out the end, right? So we're going to be able to defecate thanks to the parasympathetic nervous system. We're also going to be able to urinate, so contracting those bladder muscles from the parasympathetic nervous system as well. So in summary, for the parasympathetic nervous system, this is our rest and digest. It also is involved with excretion and reproduction and a lot of things. We could spend weeks talking about it, but the preganglionic neurons are going to be up in the brainstem and all the way down in the spinal cord, and then they're going to have really long axons that travel via cranial nerves or some sacral or pelvic nerves to get out to those ganglia, the parasympathetic ganglia, because they're like right at the target effector organ. But so in that ganglia, you're going to find your postganglionic neuron, which is then going to have a short axon to the effector organ. Now, I skipped ahead a little bit, sorry. So the vagus nerve is a big deal here because it is the main supplier for the thoracic and abdominal viscera. So all of the parasympathetic innervation to our heart, to our lungs, to our digestive system is coming via the vagus nerve from up in the brainstem there. And so it's an acetylcholine and acetylcholine at both axon terminals. And then the effects are going to be pupillary constriction, lacrimation, which is tearing, salivation, digestion with peristalsis and secretion of digestive juices, urinary excretion, that constriction of the bronchi, slowing of the heart rate is a big one, and defecation, being able to go to the bathroom. All right, so that is the parasympathetic nervous system, and this has been kind of a lengthy lecture so far, so I think we'll do the cases in lab. I'll see you there.